Sidak Atnakastan, Sidak Stepanie Carroll, Tishu Sta. Hi, I'm Stepanie Russo Carroll. I'm Atna Athabaskan from the native village of Kulika along the Copper River in Alaska. And I'm joining you here today from the unceded homelands of the Tohono Nation and the lands of the Pasquayaqui tribe in Tucson, Arizona. And I'll talk to you about the significance of Indigenous data sovereignty and governance. Our story begins with the fact that our peoples, Indigenous peoples, have always been data experts. We've collected, analyzed, used, stored, and conveyed information in very many different ways over the years. And we have a deep and rich history of doing so. Indigenous peoples span the globe. There's not one overriding definition that's often used, but we look to the United Nations for their definition over time. Some of the important pieces that I'd like to point out about the UN definition are the strong link to territories and surrounding natural resources, the fact that Indigenous peoples have distinct social, economic, and/or political systems, and a resolve to maintain and reproduce their ancestral environments and systems as distinctive peoples and communities. I'd like to always point out, too, that the UN definition and other definitions are often and usually affected by politics. And so you'll see carving out of specific Indigenous peoples based on where those definitions originate from. So for instance, in Western Europe, the UN definition only recognizes the Roma, who coincidentally do not have any land base that might cause conflict with those nation states in Western Europe. So I always challenge folks to think about and consider what the politics are about who are defined as Indigenous peoples, and look to Indigenous peoples as those who are experts in defining themselves. Indigenous data broadly are information and knowledge in any format, especially today where we can digitize almost anything, that impact Indigenous peoples, nations, and communities at the collective and individual levels. They're data about our resources and environments. They are our observations about our lands and waters, our soil, our sacred sites, our territories and plants. They're data about us as individuals, so administrative data and systems, legal data, health data. They are data about us as collectives, and this is of utmost importance. So data about us as nations and peoples, our traditional cultural information, our archives, our oral histories, our languages, our literature, our ancestral and clan knowledge, our stories and belongings. Colonization has introduced epistemicide, or the killing, suppression, and co-optation of knowledge systems. This is a very important concept to think about with respect to science, which often is an overriding way of knowing that's placed upon how we analyze Earth observations and observations about our environment in general. We are going through a period where we're actively seeing Indigenous people pushing back against this epistemicide, working to decolonize, reclaim, remember our communities, and move towards knowledge democracy. Indigenous data sovereignty fits within this paradigm shift where we're trying to reemerge with our knowledge systems and our data systems. Indigenous data sovereignty is the right of Indigenous peoples and nations to govern the collection, ownership, and application of their own data. Indigenous data sovereignty derives from inherent rights to govern people's lands and resources. You see Genesis and our traditions, our roles and responsibilities for the use of community-held information. This is that history that I spoke of very briefly about how we've always been data experts. We position ourselves with Indigenous data sovereignty within a human rights framework. So we utilize the UN Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous Peoples, as well as court cases, treaties, and our federal recognition or state recognition within our nation states. But we are not dependent on those frameworks or those cases. And most importantly, knowledge belongs to the collective and is fundamental to who we are as peoples. Indigenous data sovereignty recognizes a need for both rebuilding our data systems as we rebuild ourselves as peoples and nations. And in order to do that, we must at once seek data for governance, so data for decision making, data to inform what actions we take, data to derive our relationships from. And at the same time, we need to be governing that data, so caring for that data. I present to you here a US example from the US Environmental Protection Agency and the DINÉ, or Navajo Nation. There was a mine tailing spill a few years ago from the Cold King mine that affected 2 rivers within the Navajo Nation. And when that spill happened, the US EPA measured the effect of risk exposure for humans only, through just the point of view of a hiker who might interact with that water by putting it in a water bottle, maybe filtering it. We see here that the methodology, or the way of knowing that's informing what methods are used to assess risk, comes from the perspective and even the political perspective of the US Environmental Protection Agency at that time. A research project led by a number of Navajo principal investigators out of 3 universities, so the University of Arizona, Northern Arizona University, and Fort Lewis College, as well as with DINÉ College on the Navajo Nation, the oldest US tribal college, and a number of community organizations, the Navajo Nation, some of their local chapters, which included over 150 different individuals, a lot of students, both high school and college level, work to figure out what the actual exposure pathways might be for the Navajo who are living along the San Juan River. What you see here is the shift, as my colleague Dominique Davis-Chavez has pointed out, of a level of community participation, where previously you might have had a contractual or consultative relationship between the US EPA, or none at all, where community members were asked for opinions or maybe even contracted to perform some of the work in the area. But the Gold King Mine project has really shifted towards an Indigenous-led process, or a collegial process, where community members are leading and centering Indigenous value systems and historical contexts, and community members have authority over the research process. So what you began to see happen is the researchers who are grounded in their communities, who also had other experts, so allied experts who might have been, who were actually engineers and water quality experts, working with them and answering questions, but seeing how the methodology, or the Navajo way of knowing, was leading the process. And so it led how, what questions were asked, the format those questions were asked in, and so how people were approached and included in the process within the community. So how the farmers along the river were included, how households along the river were included. And so you saw the shift in paradigm. And what this shift aligns to, and is a set of guiding questions that wasn't used for this, but was adhered to by guiding through Indigenous ways of knowing. So in terms of having responsible research practice with Indigenous communities, you can look to the UN Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous Peoples and other working group recommendations, and go through these questions and think through how are Indigenous community members included in the decision to initiate the study. So in the Gold King Mine study, you saw this as a real call for knowledge necessary to answer the questions on the ground in the community, because what they saw coming from the US EPA reflected none of their reality. And to think through the rest of these questions about the level of authority regarding the whole process, the analysis, the collection of data, how accessible findings are to community members, and what the outputs are focused on, not only focused on Western research output, but outputs that are meaningful for community members. So in terms of the risk assessment for the community, over 40 different exposure pathways were identified by community members that fell into loosely about 4 or 5 different categories. But what's important is you begin to see the deep and rich way through knowledge on the ground that people may be exposed to a mine tailings spill in the river. I want to point out here that while what you're seeing is a decolonization of the process and an Indigenous-led process, a shift in the methodology, which somewhat shifted the methods that were used, might change how the questions are asked, but might not move from a focus group, for instance, has led to a much richer analysis and product in the end. What you don't see here are some pathways that were not included in the pictorial view because they're protected sources of knowledge. So once you have Indigenous data sovereignty, where you're having Indigenous-led research projects that affect how the data are collected, stored, analyzed, and used, so how they are governed, because some pieces aren't shared in the end. So what we're really thinking about here is governing Indigenous data, and how do we enhance data relationships so tribes can be governing their own data and have the capability and capacity and the systems to do that, both the governance systems, but also the technical systems and the infrastructure, and then enhancing these data relationships so that external data stewards are managing by tribal data standards, so that you're having relationships to affect how the US Census is storing, analyzing, using, and sharing information, or any other body. So in a vacuum internationally, where you don't have a lot of guidance specifically around Indigenous data, the Research Data Alliance hosted a group on international Indigenous data sovereignty led by myself and some other colleagues. And one of our working groups there was to develop principles for Indigenous data governance. In November 2019, actually in November 2018, we met in Botswana, and myself and Maui Hudson from the University of Waikato led a workshop where we developed the care principles for Indigenous data governance. And over the next 6 or 7 months after that, we vetted those through our networks within our nation states, so in Australia, Canada, New Zealand, and the US, as well as through a network of Indigenous leaders and colleagues to refine these principles. So the principles of collective benefit include for inclusive development and innovation, for improved governance and citizen engagement, for equitable outcomes. The principle of authority to control recognizes Indigenous rights and interests and is really grounded in that feedback loop of data for governance and governance of data. Importantly, the principle of responsibility is for positive relationships. It's for expanding capability and capacity in Indigenous communities and for Indigenous languages and worldviews. And finally, we are grounded in ethics for minimizing harm and maximizing benefit, for justice, and for thinking about and working towards protecting and leading with Indigenous values for future use of data. These principles are set against the backdrop of other principles around data that already exist. We've linked up strongly with the FAIR principles, meaning findable, accessible, interoperable, and reusable, which were originally put forth for scientific data, and you've seen uptake not only within science, but in government and other sectors for use of these. And so when we looked at the existing principles that were out there, the vast majority of them really only relate to the data themselves. And so we wanted to compare that with some of the principles that had come out of our nation state-based Indigenous data sovereignty networks, where we really saw that, yes, they were also addressing these principles around data. So is data accessible, for instance, but also addressing issues of people and purpose in the data. And so we really wanted to be able to give guidance on how to, for Indigenous peoples, infuse the people and purpose, the Indigenous values and ethics into data relationships between those other entities and Indigenous peoples. So the CARE principles are meant to inform and guide relationships with Indigenous peoples around Indigenous data and begin to lead towards realizing Indigenous data governance through enacting those in policy, so putting forth elements of the principles within an institutional policy, whether it be a government, a research institution, or a university, and then creating elements of practice. So what are the mechanisms and tools that we can use to really assert Indigenous data governance and reflect within data systems the rights and responsibilities? So as we think about large data systems or secondary use data sets, there are some issues for Indigenous peoples and concerns about contributing our knowledge and our information to those. We're concerned about how to recognize Indigenous rights and interests. We're concerned about how to share and collaborate around ethical access and use. And we're concerned about how to negotiate equitable outcomes. One of the mechanisms that we've started to work for and put forth are thinking through how metadata labels can enrich and move forward our relationships for ethical and responsible stewardship of data. There are an existing set of labels, the traditional knowledge labels, which affect Indigenous knowledge and community knowledge in collections. And those have been worked on by the group called Local Context and created in collaboration with Indigenous communities and applied across the globe. And in an effort to enrich those labels and move towards some labels for science and scientific data, there's now pilot projects in New Zealand working to create biocultural labels, or actually to implement biocultural labels. And the overlap means that we're talking about data sets that are cultural objects or Indigenous flora and fauna right now. So the ecosystem for these labeling systems, so the traditional knowledge labels and the biocultural labels, are comprised of sets of labels, metadata labels and tags, and notices. And so the labels are applied by communities to make transparent ethical use and practice of the data. And then the notices are applied by researchers or institutions. So researchers can apply traditional knowledge and biocultural notices to their data sets to acknowledge Indigenous rights and create space for the labels. So they say, you might say in an existing data set that you want to apply labels, but you need to do so in collaboration with the community to do so, and that you're willing to do so. And cultural institution notices are applied to demonstrate openness to applying labels. So although a lot of this work comes out of cultural institutions, libraries, archives, and museums, it is really important to think through how practices can impact how we behave within scientific spheres. So the Biocultural Label Initiative is really working to put data in context, to make visible the provenance and the ethics and the consents in collection and research, and to set out mutually agreed upon terms for the future use of this data. It identifies possibilities for benefit sharing and clarifies data availability and future use. And most importantly, it connects data to people, to the environments, and to relationships over time. The working group is presented here with seed funding from the Catalyst Fund to implement the biocultural labels within projects in New Zealand. And hopefully we will see this grow across continents and the globe. So the biocultural labels consist right now of a set of 6 labels. The first assures provenance, so it identifies the provenance of the data. It assures that the consent of the community has been verified, so whatever that consenting mechanism is, can indicate openness to collaboration or commercialization, can indicate when multiple communities might have rights and interest in the data, and can define research use. So for instance, the provenance label is used to indicate that Indigenous peoples have the right to use and make decisions about the future use of information, biological collections, data, and digital sequence information that derive from the associated lands, waters, and territories. It supports the practice of proper and appropriate acknowledgement of such data and the relationships into the future. And for our second example, the research use biocultural label indicates that permissioning the use of information collections, data, and digital sequence information for unspecified research. It doesn't give permission for commercialization use, but it indicates that the data are open for research use via the relationships from the other labels. Now, switching from that metadata tagging and labeling over to the notices, we begin to think through how the notices are distinct interventions from the traditional knowledge or biocultural labels that necessitate community direction for the application. On the other hand, notices are applied by researchers or institutions. They come as a package, they're not customizable, and the notice is used as a placeholder on data or in a sample field or metadata until a TK or a BC label can be applied to replace it. So until that relationship is actualized and realized through application of the label. So a researcher applies this when they don't have that set relationship yet, or when they're working through that relationship. An optional notice use statement can be applied for publication or promotional use. So if you think about if you publish in Nature, it can be part of the information that's put forth. So the TK notice is used to recognize that knowledge associated with traditional lands, waters, and territories are contributed to information collections, data, and digital sequence information. It acknowledges that place-based knowledge carries accompanying cultural rights and responsibilities, and that appropriate permissions may need to be sought for future use of the material. On the other hand, the biocultural notice is used to recognize the rights of Indigenous peoples to permission the use of information. It acknowledges the importance of cultural protocols and recognizes that appropriate permissions may need to be sought for future use of the material. So in this picture, you see the data life cycle, and how on the upper left, communities and researchers apply the biocultural labels in a metadata field through this relationship, and how in the research process, so an institution, a researcher can apply a TK or BC notice to their data set, and an institution can apply a notice as well. And then once you begin to see through the data life cycles, as these data travel through, that these labels and notices continue through. Most important for the labels is that you have an association of provenance and the rights and interests as the data that go through the data system. What we see more broadly for research repositories and thinking about how we build our large data sets are thinking through the issues of tribal identifiers, so naming and using tribal data as sensitive data, and the issues of aggregating data and saying this is Indigenous data, American Indian data, Alaska Native data, and how you begin to see a complex system where you cannot go back and seek permission from a specific Indigenous peoples if you don't have tribal identifiers in your data. So while tribal identifiers create this notion of sensitive data where you must seek and set up relationships around that data, we also see how complex it can be if we don't have those relationships, because then you begin to enter into this world of how do you protect that data and that knowledge. So we assert in repositories that restrictions should be operative anytime the data includes data and information from tribes and individuals. And This language comes from the National Congress of American Indians here in the US when they drafted commentary for the National Institutes of Health Policy for Data Management, but I think it's broadly applicable. Data repositories must include statements, not only including labels such as cultural institutional labels and so forth, but they must put forth that researchers must document how they are respecting the preferences of Indigenous nations to share or not share their data. So in our context in the US, that means that I need to include documentation of how my data sharing or my data or my research process was approved by the community. That could be a tribal IRB, it could be a tribal resolution. There are many different ways that that happens in the US. And then we need to describe in detail how the plan implements tribal requirements on data management and sharing to ensure that Indigenous peoples are protected and their lands and their resources are protected. Most importantly, we're moving to this world where we need to think about how we can enrich metadata, whether or not it contains Indigenous data, but for Indigenous data, it's very important that we think through the issues of provenance and transparency, and how we begin to apply metadata to data within repositories to enhance provenance and those rights and interests. So the next steps for the CARE principles implementations are thinking through not only how you move from the principles to policy to practice, and implement through those tools and mechanisms like traditional knowledge, labels, or notices, but also think through how do you implement each of the principles of the CARE set of principles. How do you do that together? What are the criteria? What are the methodology? And how do you operationalize within FAIR and CARE? And this is actually the work that we're doing right now. Finally, I want to leave with you about how we think through empowering Indigenous data sovereignty and governance, and really underscore the responsibility to recognize and promote sovereignty, to make sure that you're dialoguing with multiple ways of knowing. So often leading with Indigenous ways of knowing, but it is important that we all come to the table and recognize our positionality, who we are, our beliefs, our ethics as individuals, our beliefs and ethics as from a disciplinary perspective, and our responsibility of how we behave in a research relationship. The importance of being invited into space and place, and of really having a give and take. And this applies not only to allied researchers who are non-Indigenous, but those like myself who are Indigenous researchers, but may perform research in my own community or in other communities. And what my responsibilities are to always be thinking about the importance of really having a dialogue of ways of knowing and leading with Indigenous ingenuity and core values at all times. It is really important for us to be conducting science in service to community, and working through community-driven research that builds capacity and capability within communities. So if you're conducting research or observing and collecting data in communities, how can you not only do that in a way that includes multiple ways of knowing that might lead with Indigenous core values, but will also train Indigenous youth and communities in their own ways of doing, but also in other scientific methods as well. It is extremely important to engage and promote Indigenous scholarship. This can be done in a number of ways. It is done through that training. It is done by seeking Indigenous leadership, but within the Western scheme, it's done by including Indigenous peoples and those who have deep-rooted Indigenous relationships in grant review processes, in the creation of funder programming, in editor positions, in reviewer positions for journals, and so on and so forth. It also means including Indigenous peoples in your authorship list. And I always talk with my research team about how we talk through authorship and the different roles and responsibilities, and how you invite those who've contributed in the variety of ways that aren't recognized by non-Indigenous systems, and contributions of traditional knowledge, and contributions of labor and care through it. People can always say no, that they want to be recognized in other ways, but working through and being honest through dialogue to indicate who should be an author, because we know that once we start writing about things, they become tagged to our name. And if they're not our stories, how can we have our name associated with them? So thinking through what those responsibilities are. We need to use and support existing tribal and Indigenous data governance protocols and procedures, and recognize that sometimes those are not written, and that they vary widely across Indigenous communities. We need to acknowledge that as researchers, that sometimes we're going to be developing those through a co-production or a support mechanism with the communities that we're working with. We need to fight for funding of infrastructure, capability, and capacity development within Indigenous communities. We need to make sure that that funding is coming from government, nonprofit, foundation, other sources. In my own discipline of public health, as you saw the buildup of public health over the past 2 or 3 decades, you saw this development and funding of infrastructure for mainstream public health within counties and municipalities and states within the United States. But the truth is that tribes in the US have the same public health authority that those other entities have, but they weren't invested in the same way. And so we need to make sure that we're always looking and assuring that we're investing in the infrastructure of Indigenous communities. And finally, I leave you with the challenge to unapologetically challenge those with privilege, and to make the invisible visible, to think through how the co-optation and suppression of knowledge systems has occurred, and what the damages are if we take knowledge out of context, specifically deep-rooted Indigenous knowledge, which has been in place for and interacted with a single place over time. And what that means if we take that knowledge out of that and begin to use it in other contexts, and how it might not translate, how it might be irresponsible to not include the Indigenous peoples and the knowledge system that it comes from in the processes and practices. Finally, I want to leave you with a few resources from our Global Indigenous Data Alliance, which hosts the CARE Principles for Indigenous Data Sovereignty. I myself am a co-founder of the US Indigenous Data Sovereignty Network, and I'm a assistant professor at the Mellon Enid Zuckerman College of Public Health, as well as the associate director of the Native Nations Institute, and on the implementation team for Enrich, which seeks to grow Indigenous data relationships and produce those mechanisms and tools through relationships with projects and peoples across the globe. Thank you very much. Chinan.